The promissory note lay in the middle of Clayton Vance's desk, and Becca could not stop looking at it. Her father sat rigid beside her, hat in his lap, knuckles pale around the brim. Clayton stood on the other side of the desk instead of sitting behind it, as though putting the wood between them would have made this easier for anyone. "Marry me, Miss Nolan," he said, "and your father's debt ends here." Horace was on his feet before Becca could speak. "You don't have to answer him." Clayton didn't look away from her. "I mean every word of it." Becca kept her eyes on the note, her father's signature at the bottom, the numbers beside it. The red line where someone, Clayton she assumed, had already marked the due date past. "All of it," she said. "Every dollar. Gone. Every dollar. No land." "No land," he confirmed. "No cattle, no equipment, nothing signed over." She held his eyes as she said it. "Nothing. And after the wedding, my father owes you nothing at all. No favors, no obligations. Nothing that comes due later." Clayton's jaw tightened, as if the question stung more than he expected. "Nothing," he said again. She believed him. That was almost the worst part. The debt itself she understood well enough. Money borrowed against a good season, for seed, a mended plow, an extra hand to work more acres than her father could manage alone. Then drought through spring, and a hailstorm that flattened what little survived it. Enough came in to keep seed for next year and food through winter. Not enough for Clayton. It wasn't a trap. Clayton hadn't engineered any of it. He'd simply noticed, once the debt came due, exactly what he wanted to do with the leverage sitting in front of him. "Why me?" Becca asked. "I've watched you a long time." "Then why didn't you ask before any of this?" He paused long enough that she heard the pause. "I didn't think you'd say yes. And now you think I have fewer ways to say no." He didn't argue the point. Somehow, that made it harder to hate him. She asked to speak with her father alone, and Clayton left without a word, closing the door behind him. "Say no," Horace said the moment they were alone. "We'll sell the North Field, some of the herd. We'll start smaller." She knew what starting smaller would cost him, not just land, but the years it had taken to build what little he had left. "I don't love him," she said. "Then that's reason enough." "Maybe it should be." She folded her hands in her lap. "It isn't the only thing I have to think about." She knew what she knew of Clayton Vance. No cruelty in his name around town, no drink, no temper anyone spoke of. Fair dealings with her father, up until today. It wasn't nothing. It also wasn't enough to make her want this. But it was enough to make the choice hers, instead of her father's ruin making it for her. When Clayton came back in, she was already standing. "I'll marry you." No one in the room looked like they'd won anything. Her father's face went through something Becca couldn't watch straight on. Clayton exhaled, relief, plainly, but whatever showed on her own face stopped him from letting it reach his eyes. He picked up the promissory note from the desk, held it out to her instead of her father. "Burn it." She looked at the paper a moment longer than she needed to. Then she carried it to her father herself and set it in his hands. "It's over," she said. Horace's hand closed around the paper, but he made no move toward the stove. Clayton didn't press him. Becca turned and found Clayton watching her. Neither spoke. Then Horace rose, and the room moved again. Clayton kept every promise made in that office. Within the week, the note was ash. Horace kept his land, his herd, his water rights. No papers changed hands beyond what erased the debt itself. Only the three of them needed to know why Rebecca Nolan was marrying Clayton Vance, and none of them said it aloud again. What Clayton did next, he did without asking her. He chose the date, he arranged the church, the carriage, the small reception after. He sent to Denver for a dress and had it altered without a fitting, guessing at her size from the shape of her in a doorway. When it arrived, it fit almost perfectly, close enough that she said nothing about the seam that pulled slightly at one shoulder. He filled a trunk with things he thought she'd need in her new home: linens, a shawl, a hairbrush with a silver back, and had it carried out to the ranch before she'd so much as chosen a ribbon. Once, she started to say she'd have liked to pick the flowers herself. Clayton was already 3 sentences into where he'd ordered them from, and the moment passed before she found a place to put the thought. Becca noticed all of it, said nothing, and told herself it was kindness. A busy man handling one more thing so she wouldn't have to. She did not yet notice that he had not asked her a single question the whole week. The wedding itself was small, warm enough in its way, the kind of warmth that came from Clayton's plain, unguarded happiness rather than anything shared between them. Becca stood straight through the vows, answered when she was meant to answer, and did not look like a woman in love. No one in the small church seemed to expect her to. Horace walked her down the aisle himself. At the front, before he stepped back to let Clayton take her hand, he leaned in close enough that only the two of them could hear. "Take care of her." "I will," Clayton said. Horace held his eyes a moment longer than the moment required. That's not always the same as making her happy. Clayton didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. At the ranch house, Clayton walked her through it himself, room by room, the way a man shows off something he's proud of. The bedroom, the wardrobe already filled, 3 new dresses, still smelling of the store, a shelf of books he'd guessed she might like, a vanity with a mirror larger than any she'd owned in her life. She touched the edge of the vanity, then the spines of the books, reading none of the titles closely enough to remember them later. Agnes Bell ran the house. Men she hadn't met yet ran the grounds. Somewhere between the kitchen and the barn, there was already a person assigned to nearly everything Becca might have thought to do herself. She counted the doors on the way to the bedroom and lost count of how many of them led to rooms she had no reason to enter. "You'll never have to work again," Clayton told her, and he meant it as a gift. "Never?" "Not if I can help it." He smiled when he said it, easy and certain, and for a moment, Becca let herself believe this life might not be so hard to live after all. For the first weeks, Clayton was as generous a husband as any woman in the territory could have asked for. He brought home ribbon, a bolt of good wool, a pair of gloves lined in rabbit fur. He asked, more than once, if she wanted for anything. He never pressed her for more affection than she had to give, and he never once mentioned that she'd come to him with less than he had. When she mentioned, once, that her mother had kept bees, he had a hive delivered within the month, though neither of them knew the first thing about tending it. He also left before sunrise most mornings and rarely returned before dark. Becca tried, in those first days, to find her place inside the house the way she'd always found her place inside a day's work. She went down to the kitchen one morning, meaning to help Agnes with the bread. "Mrs. Vance." Agnes wiped her hands on her apron, not unkindly. "Mr. Vance said you weren't to trouble yourself." "It's no trouble. I've made bread most mornings of my life." "I know, ma'am, but it's not mine to change." Becca went to the sitting room instead and found a curtain with a torn hem she thought she might mend. A seamstress came twice a week for exactly that kind of work, she was told. She thought of the kitchen garden going to seed behind the house and offered to weed it. There was a man for the garden. She packed a lunch to carry out to the hands at midday, the way she'd done for her father 100 times, and was told, gently, that a boy already wrote it out each noon. She asked once about the household ledger, thinking she might at least check the sums, and was handed a cup of tea instead, and told the clerk had it well in order. Cook, seamstress, gardener, hand, clerk for the accounts. No one refused her unkindly. No one refused her at all, exactly. They simply already had it handled, every time, before she reached for it. Some afternoons, she stood at the parlor window and watched the hands moving cattle in the far pasture, too far off to hear, close enough to see the dust rise where they worked. She would stand there long enough that Agnes started leaving the good tea within reach, without being asked, as if she'd noticed something and didn't know what else to do about it. Horace came out to see her 3 weeks in. He walked the porch, admired the dress she was wearing, the size of the parlor, the shine on the floors. He said the ranch suited her, that Clayton had done right by her. Becca smiled and did not correct him. "Keeping busy?" he asked her, when Clayton had stepped away to speak with Warren. "There isn't much to keep busy with," Horace looked at her a moment. He didn't ask anything further, and she was glad of it, because she wasn't sure what she would have said if he had. One evening, Clayton noticed her quieter than usual over supper. He didn't ask why. The next evening, he came home with a shawl the color of the hills at dusk, soft enough that she gasped a little when she touched it. "I saw it in town and thought of you," he said. "It's lovely. Thank you." He looked pleased with himself the rest of the night, certain he'd fixed whatever had been wrong. Later, alone, Becca folded the shawl along its own crease and carried it to the wardrobe. She opened the drawer where she kept the things he'd given her since the wedding. A book she hadn't finished, a comb she hadn't used, a pair of gloves still folded exactly as they'd come from the store. She laid the shawl on top of the others. She stood there a moment with her hand still on the drawer before she closed it. The ranch wasn't failing. Clayton would have said as much to anyone who asked, and he wouldn't have been lying. But he'd expanded faster than the last 2 seasons could easily carry, and now the ground he'd gained on paper was harder to hold than it had looked on paper. Cattle prices had dropped further than anyone expected. Shipping costs had climbed the same week feed prices did, right as a hard winter made feed impossible to skimp on. One buyer in Cheyenne was trying to knock the price down further still, betting Clayton couldn't afford to wait him out. Part of the herd would have to be held back and fed through another month just to avoid selling at a loss. None of it was any one man's fault. It was simply a bad year, arriving on top of a ranch that had grown too large, too fast to absorb one easily. Warren brought in the numbers most evenings now. In most evenings, there was something in them that needed deciding before morning. Buyers, shipping routes, grazing, payroll. Clayton took to handling it all himself, the way he handled everything, and the hours he kept grew longer for it. He was at his desk before the house woke, and often still at it after Becca had given up waiting and gone to bed alone. Becca noticed the pattern before she said anything about it. One night she asked, plainly, what was wrong. "Nothing you need to worry about," Clayton said, and went back to the ledger. A few days later, she overheard him and Warren discussing the herd, how much to sell now, at the poor price, and how much to hold. She'd stopped in the hallway with a stack of linens in her arms, close enough to hear, not quite close enough to be part of the conversation. "If the price is that poor," she said afterward, "do you have to sell all of them now?" It wasn't advice. It was a question, asked plainly, the kind her father might have asked at his own kitchen table. Clayton was tired, and it came out sharper than he meant it. "Running a ranch is more complicated than that, Becca." She said nothing further. He didn't notice that she'd stopped asking. One evening she set the table herself and waited, the food gone from warm to merely edible by the time she gave up guessing when he'd be home. He came in 2 hours past dark, without a word sent ahead, boots still carrying the smell of the barn. She asked, once he was seated, whether he might at least send someone to tell her when he'd be late. "I had more important things to think about than supper," he said. She stood there a moment, then took her plate and left the room. It wasn't the food. She understood a man could be too busy for supper. What sat wrong was smaller and harder to name, and she carried it to bed without trying. Clayton sat alone at the table afterward, the ledger open in front of him, the numbers no clearer for staring at them. He thought of the times he'd seen her before any of this. Once in town, laughing at something outside the mercantile with a woman he didn't recognize. Once riding past the Nolan place and catching her in the garden with Horace, sleeves pushed up, dirt on her hands, laughing at whatever her father had just said. She'd look like a woman who'd never once run out of things to do. In his house, she moved differently. Quieter. Careful, almost, the way a guest is careful in someone else's rooms. He got up, eventually, and walked as far as the closed bedroom door, the floorboard by the linen closet creaking under him the way it always did. He stood there with his hand raised, not quite touching the wood. Then he let it drop, and went to bed in the room down the hall instead, leaving the ledger open on the table behind him. He didn't stay in the other room long. He lay in the dark long enough to hear the house settle, long enough to replay what he'd said at the table more times than he wanted to. The words sounded worse each time he heard them again. Eventually he got up and crossed the hall, his bare feet finding the same creaking board Warren always teased him about. The bedroom door was open a few inches. Becca sat on the edge of the bed, her back to him, one hand pressed briefly to her face before she lowered it and straightened her shoulders, trying, and mostly failing, to make it look like nothing. "I'm sorry," Clayton said, "about supper. It wasn't only tonight." He didn't argue that, either. He came in and sat down beside her, not touching her, close enough that she'd know he meant to stay. For the first time since the wedding, he told her the truth about the ranch, plainly, without smoothing it over. The prices, the buyer in Cheyenne, the herd he couldn't afford to sell yet and couldn't afford to keep feeding much longer. He told her about the note Warren had brought that afternoon and the shipment that might not clear a profit even if the weather held. Becca didn't offer him a way out of any of it. She only listened and asked a question here and there, the kind that meant she'd actually understood what he'd said, not the kind meant to sound clever. "I didn't want you carrying any of this," he told her. "Why?" "Because you shouldn't have to." She was quiet long enough that he thought she might let it go. She looked at her own hands instead, folded in her lap, the way she'd looked at them once before, in his office, over a piece of paper neither of them had wanted signed. "I married you for my father," she said instead. "You know that. I didn't love you." "I know." He'd always known. Hearing it said plainly didn't hurt the way he might have expected. He sat with it a moment, turning his wedding ring once around his finger, the way he did when he was thinking through a problem he couldn't solve by working harder at it. "I thought," he said slowly, "if I gave you a good house, and you never had to work, and never had to worry about money again, you might be happy here, even without loving me yet. I thought that would be enough to start on." Becca looked around the room, the wardrobe, the vanity, the shelf of books she'd never finished, before she looked back at him. "You've given me a great deal," she said. "Almost all of it is something you decided I should want." Clayton opened his mouth to answer, and stopped. "I don't want to go back to counting flour," she went on. "I'm not asking for that, but I don't want a house where there's nothing for me to do, and a husband I don't know how to reach, and every time I try to step into your life, someone tells me it's already been handled." She paused, and for a moment her voice caught on something she pushed past without naming. "I stood at that parlor window more afternoons than I'll admit to, watching men do work I know how to do, in a house where I'm not allowed to lift a finger. Whatever grows between us, if it grows at all, it has to come from actually living together, not from you deciding what my life should look like and handing it to me finished." Clayton said nothing for a long moment. "I want one we build together," Becca said. He looked down at his own hands, then around the room again. The same room he'd filled for her weeks ago, so certain he was giving her everything she could want. The vanity mirror caught the lamp on the nightstand and threw a small square of light across the floor between them. He thought of the shawl, folded away in a drawer she never opened without him watching. "What do you want tomorrow?" he asked, finally. She hadn't expected the question, and it showed, a small pause, as if she'd had to search for an answer she'd never been asked to have ready. "Breakfast," she said. He looked up. "I want to make it myself," she said. "Nothing fancy, just mine." He almost told her Agnes had it handled. She watched him get halfway to saying it, watched the old habit rise up in his face before he caught himself and closed his mouth instead. Becca saw him catch it. It was the first time in weeks she smiled without meaning to. Clayton smiled too, small and a little unsteady, like a man still learning the shape of something new. Becca came down to the kitchen the next morning before anyone expected her, sleeves already pushed back, hair pinned quickly instead of carefully. Agnes went still at the stove. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Vance said, Mr. Vance and I have changed the arrangement." Becca reached past her for the flour tin, familiar as an old friend. "I'll be doing breakfast most mornings if that suits you." Agnes still looked uncertain, glancing toward the hallway as if Clayton might appear and settle the matter for her. "I'm not being made to do it," Becca said. "That's the difference." She wasn't a trained cook, and the biscuits she pulled from the oven that first morning came out a shade darker than they should have, the gravy thicker than Agnes would have made it. But it was food she knew how to make with her eyes half closed, from a kitchen that had once been her own, a recipe she'd made 100 times before, back when the stove was smaller and the kitchen colder in winter. Clayton had arranged, without saying so, to be home for it. He came in from the barn still smelling of hay and horse, sat down without waiting to be asked twice, and ate 2 helpings before Becca said anything. "You don't have to pretend." "I'm not pretending," he said, reaching for another biscuit despite the scorched bottom. "I'm hungry." It was the first meal in the house that felt like something shared instead of something served. Over the following weeks, Becca found her way into smaller corners of the ranch's life. Not the herd, not the buyers. Nothing Clayton would have called her business. She helped with the household accounts instead, checking deliveries against invoices, sorting receipts into some order Agnes had never quite managed, making sure the ranch hand's food supplies matched what had actually been paid for. It wasn't glamorous work. Most days it meant an hour at the kitchen table with a stack of paper and a cup of coffee gone cold, but it was hers to do, and no one took it from her. One evening, she found a delivery charged twice on the same invoice, the numbers close enough that anyone in a hurry might have missed it. She set it in front of Clayton without much ceremony, the way she might have set down a plate. He looked it over twice before he looked up at her, genuinely surprised, as if he'd forgotten she was capable of catching something Warren and the clerk both had missed. "I finally found something to do," she said, and went back to what she'd been doing. Clayton changed too, in smaller ways than she had. If he was going to be late, he sent word ahead now, even if it was only a boy on horseback with 2 sentences to deliver. Most evenings he made a point of eating with her, and afterward he carried his papers into the sitting room instead of shutting himself away in the study, working through the accounts while Becca read or mended nearby, the 2 of them close enough to trade a word without raising their voices. Some nights, neither of them said much of anything at all. The lamp burned low, the fire settled, and the only sound was the scratch of his pen and the occasional turn of a page. Once, without looking up, he reached over and moved her cold coffee out of reach of his ledger, and she let him, and neither of them remarked on it. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't especially eventful. There was no music to it, no grand gesture. Nothing anyone in town would have thought worth mentioning over supper. The months that followed weren't easy exactly, but they were steadier. Clayton and Warren worked through the herd problem the way ranchers had always worked through hard seasons. Holding back what they could afford to hold, pushing the Cheyenne buyer for a fairer price instead of taking the first offer out of desperation. Trimming back the expansion plans that had stretched them thin in the first place. There was a stretch in June when it still looked like it might go badly, when Warren came in with a face that made Becca set down whatever she was holding. It didn't, in the end. By late summer, they'd found a better contract with a buyer out of Denver, and the worst of the pressure eased. None of it was Becca's doing. Not really. She hadn't saved the ranch. What she'd done was smaller, kept the paperwork straight, asked the occasional question that made Clayton slow down and think twice, and sat across from him some evenings when there was nothing useful to say and no need to say anything. One morning Agnes caught her humming over the dishes, some tune neither of them could have named, Becca's hands moving through the wash water without her seeming to notice them at all. "You smile more now," Agnes said. Becca looked up, surprised, soap suds still on her wrists. "Do I?" "Much more. Since the spring, I'd say." Becca didn't answer that, but she thought about it later, alone in the garden with a basket of mending she'd taken to doing on the back steps some afternoons, and found she couldn't quite argue with it. Clayton had to travel to Cheyenne that summer to settle terms with the buyer directly and was gone 2 nights. On the second afternoon, Becca found herself glancing up from the ledger every time she heard hooves on the road and put down her pen each time to listen, and went back to work each time it wasn't him. Agnes noticed. She said nothing about it, only set an extra place at the table that evening without being asked. When Clayton finally rode in past sundown, dust still on his coat and the horse blowing hard from the last stretch, Becca was halfway to the porch before she caught herself and slowed to something closer to a walk, smoothing her apron as if that had been her reason for coming outside at all. "Miss me?" he asked, swinging down from the horse. "You're late," she said. She was smiling when she said it, and he didn't miss that either. That evening, going over the numbers from the trip, he pushed the ledger a few inches toward her instead of turning it away the way he once would have. "What do you think?" It wasn't a question he was asking to fill a silence. He waited for her answer the way a man waits when he actually intends to use what he hears, watching her face while she read down the column instead of glancing back at his own notes. She pointed to a figure that seemed high for the season and asked why. He didn't have a ready answer, and said so, and made a note to ask Warren about it in the morning instead of brushing the question aside. They talked past the point where the numbers needed talking about, drifting into other things, the weather, a letter from Horace, nothing important, and neither of them noticed until the lamp had burned low and the fire needed building up again. It started small enough that Becca almost missed it herself, a tiredness that came earlier in the evening than it used to, a plate of stew she couldn't finish, the smell of coffee turning her stomach in a way it never had before. She blamed the heat for a week before she stopped believing her own excuse. Agnes noticed before Becca said a word about it, the way she noticed most things in that house. "Might be worth a visit to Dr. Merrill," she said one morning, setting down the tea a little too carefully, just to be sure. Becca went into town the following week, half suspecting what she'd hear before she heard it. The doctor confirmed what Agnes had already guessed. Becca chose to tell Clayton that evening, while he was bent over the ledger and she was mending at the other end of the table. She reached over and pressed her hand flat on the page until he looked up. "Clayton?" He set down his pen, she told him. For a moment, he didn't move at all. Then he was out of his chair, pulling her up with him, holding her so tightly she laughed and told him to mind her ribs. He kissed her forehead, then her hair, then said something about the doctor that didn't quite finish as a sentence, and for a good minute seemed to have no idea what to do with his own hands. By the next morning, the old habit was back in full force. No trips to the barn, no lifting anything heavier than a teacup. The accounts could wait, Agnes would manage the household, and Becca should rest. She let him get halfway through the list before she spoke. "Clayton?" He stopped. "Are we going back to the beginning?" He closed his eyes, caught, and something like a laugh escaped him despite himself. "No," he said, then quieter. "I'm worried." "You can worry," she said. "You don't get to decide everything." "Fair." He admitted, plainly, that it was only her and the child he was thinking of, not the accounts, not the garden, just the two of them. She told him she'd listened to the doctor, that she knew her own limits well enough to mind them without being told twice, and that this time the deciding would be hers to do, not his to hand her already finished. Clayton greeted, and mostly kept to it. The months that followed passed the way months do when there's something to wait for. Becca kept a lighter work, and more than once Clayton started to stop her from some small task, then caught himself and let her finish it instead. He was home earlier most evenings now, without needing to be asked. Some evenings they walked the near pasture together, slower than either of them was used to, Becca's hand tucked into his elbow more for the company than for support. In the last months, he took to resting his hand against her side in the evenings, waiting for the small movement underneath his palm, and once, when he thought she was asleep, said something low and unpolished to the child that hadn't arrived yet. Nothing Becca ever told him she'd heard. The day came in early spring, faster than anyone expected. Agnes and the midwife took over the bedroom before Clayton fully understood what was happening, and he found himself standing in the hallway with the door firmly between him and everything he might have wanted to do. He walked its length more times than he could count, boots loud on the floorboards, until Agnes stuck her head out once just to tell him to sit down somewhere, please. He didn't. He was standing at the far window when Warren found him. "Got a problem with the north fence," Warren said. "Fairly important." Handle it. It's the kind of important that usually wants your say. Clayton looked at the closed door down the hall. Not tonight, Warren. Warren looked at him a moment, then took off his hat and sat down on the porch step to wait it out with them instead of pressing the matter further. Neither of them said much after that. Every so often, Warren offered some remark about the fence or the weather, or nothing at all, mostly to fill the silence rather than to be answered. From inside, Clayton could hear Becca now and then, low sounds that made him stop pacing each time and stand very still, both hands braced against the windowsill. There was nothing in it he could fix, nothing he could arrange or send for or hand off to someone better suited. He stood there anyway, listening, because it was the only thing left he could do. At one point he pressed his forehead briefly against the door frame, then straightened again when he heard Agnes moving inside. It was well past midnight when the sound changed, a thin, furious cry cutting through the walls. The door opened. Agnes stood in it, tired and smiling. "It's a boy." Clayton didn't move toward her. He went past her, into the room, straight to the bed. "Becca?" She looked up at him, pale and worn through, her hair damp against the pillow. "Are you all right?" "I'm all right, Clayton." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since sundown, and only then turned to look at the small bundle in the midwife's arms. He took his son carefully, the way a man holds something he's afraid he might do wrong, and stood there a moment, adjusting to the weight of him, one large hand nearly covering the whole of the baby's back. The boy quieted almost at once, as if he recognized something in it. Becca watched him from the bed, the two of them, her husband and her son, neither of them saying anything at all. She didn't tell him she loved him. She didn't have to. Clayton looked up from the baby and found her watching him, and for a long moment, neither of them looked away. 4 years on, the Vance Ranch looked like a place that had weathered its rough seasons and come out steadier for them. The herd had grown back past what it had been before the bad year, and Warren still ran the grounds the way he always had. Their son was somewhere past the corral, chasing a barn cat with more enthusiasm than any real hope of catching it. Agnes calling after him now and then to mind the fence line. He'd inherited his father's stubbornness and, from all appearances, his mother's refusal to sit still. Clayton and Becca sat on the porch in the late afternoon, the kind of quiet that had become ordinary between them over the years. Not empty, just easy. The way silence gets between two people who no longer need to fill it. Becca had a mending basket at her feet she hadn't touched in half an hour. Clayton had long since given up pretending to read the paper folded in his lap. "You know," Clayton said, watching the boy give up on the cat and start climbing the corral rail instead, "I don't believe you've ever actually told me you love me. Not once. Not since we married." "Since you bargained me into it, you mean?" "I believe the word we used at the time was married. I believe the word I used was debt." He laughed, short and low, caught out. Becca turned to look at him, unhurried about it, the way she did most things now. She didn't answer with more words. She leaned over and kissed him instead, unhurried, her hand coming to rest against his jaw. "That doesn't count," he said when she pulled back. "You're supposed to be an intelligent man." "I've heard that said. By you, mostly." "Then figure it out." He let out a long, put-upon sigh, the kind he used for effect more than for any real complaint, and reached over to take her hand anyway, his thumb moving once across her knuckles. Their son's voice carried up from the corral, calling for his mother, something about the cat and a question that needed settling immediately. Becca stood first, smoothing her skirt. Clayton stood after her, setting the paper down on the porch rail where it would probably sit forgotten until supper. Neither of them hurried. They walked down the porch steps together, side by side, the late sun throwing their shadows long across the yard, toward whatever their son needed them for now. And so another story comes to an end. Clayton loved Becca more than he had ever loved anyone else in his life. But it was Becca who taught him that loving someone is not the same as deciding what is best for them. It is something we still see around us today. Sometimes, the people who love us most work themselves to exhaustion, trying to give us security, comfort, and every opportunity they never had. Parents do it for their children. Husbands and wives do it for each other. And most of the time, it comes from a good place. But love also means listening. Sometimes the most important question we can ask the people we care about is simply, what do you want? What do you need from me? Because giving someone everything is not always the same as giving them what they need. So if you stayed with us until the end, perhaps that is the thought worth carrying with you. Love the people in your life. Listen to them, and walk beside them rather than choosing the road for them. Wishing you a peaceful day and a happy one, surrounded by the people you love.